We have some incredible speakers with us today. A few housekeeping announcements. One, all of the plates and cutlery are compostable. Please put them in the compost bin. CID is trying to be like the leaders. HKS makes it as easy as possible to be green with our events. So we just ask for you to help us with that. Follow CID on social and sign up for our newsletter to get information on all of our upcoming events beyond this. And I will now turn it over to, we have two panelists in the room, one joining us virtually. Sarah Zoen, Kyle Cahill, and Sneha Shah are here to have an incredible conversation. So I will turn it over to Sarah and then we will get going.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you to Fatima, Kate, the CID community for organizing this. Thanks to you all for coming out on a Friday. It's lovely to see you all. And for those of you online, we're going to get started really quick. Here's a quick overview of what we're going to do today in this next hour. I'm going to start with a quick poll and then we will introduce ourselves. So while I know you probably have a sandwich in one hand, so use the other hand. We're going to do a quick poll, and please do not worry if you do not know any of these terms. It's these, and yeah, if you can't see it, I'll say it. So we have first, so raise your hand if you are familiar with CSR. Let's take a, okay, yep. The UNGPs, okay, great. SDGs, okay, yes. ESG, great. And then what about CSDDD? This is a trick one. Yeah, that's great. Fantastic. So when we think about the alphabet soup, we're not going to go into all the detail of these acronyms. What do they mean? But just to say, there's a lot going on. There are a lot of terms. We're gonna what I really want to focus on today are the practical examples. How are we bringing the E and the S of ESG, which seems to be a little bit trickier? How are we bringing that together? So that'll be the bulk of this conversation. But I just wanted to get a quick poll. So we have corporate social responsibility. I'll just go through the terms so we're all clear on the definitions, more or less. Kind of a business self-regulation, a little bit older term, right? The aim of social accountability, making a positive impact on society. Then we have the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, really a set of guidelines around how states and companies prevent, address, and remedy human rights abuses committed by, within the business operations. Then we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which most of this group knows, right? So we have this universal call to action to end poverty by 2030. Then we have ESG, environmental, social, and governance, which is more around kind of like a collection of corporate performance evaluation criteria around those three kind of topic areas. And then we have CSDDD, which is the EU regulation that's coming up in process, really looking at if it's adopted, it'll really require companies to establish due diligence throughout the supply chain, both environmental and human rights due diligence. So that's up and coming and pretty new on the scene. Okay, so that was great. Thanks, you all. Okay, so really quick, we're going to introduce ourselves. I'll go first, hand it over to Sneha in New York, and then to Kyle. I'm Sarah Zoen. I come from Pillar 2. I'm an associate director based here in Boston, Watertown, and I am working with companies across all of their human rights needs. Pillar 2 is a human rights consulting firm, and I'm been in business and human rights for probably about 15 years. Kyle and I were just talking. I think we were here presenting in our old organization maybe about 10 years ago. So it's really lovely to come back and have Kyle here with me. So I'll hand it over to Sneha. Go ask yourself, and then we'll go to Kyle.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's nice to meet you. I'm Sneha Shah, and I'm a senior manager for human rights at Amazon. Specifically, I serve as our lead advisor on technology and human rights, advising our businesses on the ways that our products and services may be used in contravention of human rights norms under international standards. I specifically sit on our human rights and environmental due diligence team, where we are tasked with building out company-wide mechanisms to conduct due diligence on the ways that our business and our broader supply chain may be impacting human and environmental rights. I'm a human rights lawyer by training and have been practicing for nearly a decade prior to joining Amazon about a year ago.
Thanks so much.
Right. Hey, everyone. Kyle Cahill from Takeda. I am the Senior Director of Disclosure and Engagement. I'll tell you a little bit about that. Takeda is a global biopharmaceutical company headquartered in Tokyo, but we do have a large Preston. We're actually the largest life sciences employer in Massachusetts. We have about 50,000 employees globally. We're in about 150 countries. My role focus is specifically on the environmental sustainability aspects related to disclosure and engagement. So a lot of the things that Sarah just referenced, regulatory developments, voluntary reporting, and almost everything in between. So very eager to have this conversation. Questions, really interesting topic about sort of how the E and the S are starting to more closely align. So thanks for coming.
Excellent. Thanks, Kyle. Okay, so really quick, kind of what do we mean by ESG? That's what maybe the hook, that's one of the hooks that got you here today around ESG. What does it mean to kind of development practitioners? It's something to keep an eye on, even though it's a term that mostly investors and businesses are using. It's really it's one of the things that kind of a thread in terms of the work that we do. I mean, mostly the work that I do is not, I don't use the term ESG every day, but it is something important to kind of the connecting tissue of sorts in terms of the alphabet soup. So we have the environmental, social, and governance. Environmental being everything from climate change, strategy, biodiversity, environmental management systems, a lot of what Kyle's day-to-day, a lot of the work that he's doing, and Sneha, and then also the social. So really thinking about human rights, that includes everything that you can think of, from labor rights, gender equality, child labor, modern slavery, those types of issues. And then governance is really about what's the business ethics, what are the management systems in place. So I connect all of these three because they're all reinforcing one another. But the topic for today is really about kind of, for a long time, many of us have been working, whether it be in different departments, different business units, where maybe you have the environmental business unit, you have the human rights business unit. But it's interesting to hear from both of my colleagues here that's like, even in the titles of their job descriptions, is really bringing together more of the E and the S, which in my opinion is quite new on the scene in the last 5 years. So it's really great to see. UNGPs, I just have to say it because this is pillar 2. The work that we do is really core. The UN guiding principles is core to everything that we do. And so that's also kind of what's really a lot at the heart of what we're seeing in terms of voluntary and mandatory regulation, like kind of voluntary principles, guidance, and then moving into regulation. And so for the guiding principles, it's really this reference point to really address adverse impacts. And it's really, you can see in a lot of ESG metrics, a lot of what companies are disclosing and how they're, how are they addressing risk. The UNGPs are really core to that and kind of providing a lot of guidance. Even though the UNGPs are not binding, it's still providing a roadmap. Okay, and then this is just a quick flash of just to show you that the landscape for regulation from soft law to hard law, it is evolving rapidly. I just had to add something to my list of like, oh, there's something happening in Japan that just happened maybe less than a year ago. It is quickly evolving. It's constant. These guys are living it every day in terms of keeping up with the regulatory landscape. So I just wanted to flash this up here. There's probably things that are under discussion that aren't even on this map, but just to give you a sense of how vast it is and how there are a lot of moving pieces. I won't go into all the different legislation, but happy to chat about it at the talk afterwards. We can go through certain aspects of regulation that are current, kind of in process, or actually in force right now. Okay, so I will switch it to questions for our panelists. Okay, the first question. So we really want to understand how's this manifesting for you guys over at Takeda and Amazon. I'll start with you, Kyle. Really thinking about kind of what's that natural synergy that you've seen to bring this E and the S. Not only we've seen with job descriptions, but just kind of how does that play out in your day-to-day work? Kind of how's it manifesting for you?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. So the focus broadly for sustainability at Takeda is, this won't shock anyone, patient, people, and planet. And so we spend a lot of time, obviously, in each one of those areas, focusing on some programs that are sort of viewed as fairly distinct traditionally, I guess. So in terms of patient, thinking about something like access to medicine, obviously a huge focus area, rightly so, for big pharma companies. If you're thinking about sort of the approach to people, which can mean a lot of things, we spend a lot of time on DE&I, a lot of time on health equity. And then from a planet perspective, a lot of what we do is certainly around climate change, issues like biodiversity. But what has happened, what we've seen, I don't want to say it's recent, but it's definitely increased recently or scaled up recently, is focusing a lot of time on figuring out what are the intersections between those. So access to medicines, for instance, we have a dengue vaccine called Qdenga. Obviously, I think I shouldn't say obviously, but many of you might know that dengue is something traditionally happening in countries very far from the US, areas, tropical regions, mosquito-borne illness, climate change. One of the big reasons that dengue is becoming much more prevalent in Europe. It's actually in the US now. And so we've spent a good amount of time with our access to medicines team and with our team in our vaccines business unit, really thinking about what role can we play beyond providing the vaccine in terms of mitigation, in terms of but others that are focused on climate change at Takeda, but then obviously others at the company are traditionally working in different parts of the business. We'll have a presence at COP28, which is upcoming in December, which is sort of the biggest, I don't know how you define it, probably the biggest climate change related event annually that's really bringing together governments, for the most part, NGOs, business leaders, to really figure out, okay, how can we, lack of a better term, really get our act together and put together the right policies and practices around climate. So we're putting together an effort to organize health systems, to organize governments, to organize NGOs, to organize pharma companies, to really think about not just dengue, but what are the other vector-borne diseases that are really touching all aspects of our work. We also have a program called Sustainability by Design. And so I probably shouldn't say it, but a lot of the work in environmental sustainability is sort of like making up for our mistakes. Like how do we clean up our mess in some ways? It could be emissions, it could be waste. But as a pharma company, it's very challenging, but ideally, as much as possible, we would design out the potential negative environmental and social impacts of our products, starting from R&D all the way to end of life. So that's really given us an opportunity to think about, okay, not only how much water are we using, but from a human rights perspective, how are we potentially in our supply chain impacting the right to water? How are we impacting the right to clean air? How are we thinking about potential pharmaceuticals in the environment in local communities? So 2 examples, and there are others, about how we've really started to integrate our thinking as much as possible to the benefit of, sounding hokey, not just the planet, but people as well.
That's excellent. Thank you. Like really concrete example with dengue. Yeah, Sneha, please go ahead. Yeah, what synergies are you seeing? How does this work coming together over at Amazon? Yeah, I'm sure you can draw on a number of examples of what's happening over there.
Yeah, definitely. So, at Amazon, we already have really robust human rights and environmental programs. On the human rights side, we have systems in place to assess and address risks to people's fundamental rights, really guided by international standards, particularly the one that Sarah mentioned, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Part of these systems includes, creating and embedding policies that are not only applicable to our own business, such as our global human rights principles, but also things like supply chain standards, where we hold our suppliers to a specific standard in respecting fundamental rights as well. And really what we are striving to do by implementing the UNGPs and that sort of framework in our everyday business is to drive more responsible decision-making. We definitely believe that given our scale and our scope of our business, that we have a really broad responsibility to address the impacts that Amazon has on the people and planet. And in addition to sort of the due diligence aspect of it, we also have a really integral system of monitoring how our governance systems are working. And that's really through rigorous data collection and evaluation. We really try to take a data-driven approach to this, to not just go based on our qualitative understanding of how people are impacted, but really being able to measure what is the effect of the systems we've put in place, and how are we positively changing the impacts that we're having. And then on the environmental side, we also have been doing a tremendous amount of work to offset our environmental impacts of our business. So we at Amazon created this climate pledge. We have set a goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2040, and have made some considerable progress towards that goal through a variety of sustainability solutions, including addressing the environmental impacts of our products, our packages, use of water, other natural resources. And currently, we're also the largest private purchaser of clean energy. And so it's a really, really important goal for the company to become more sustainable and continue to make progress towards that. Now, bringing these two together, as Sarah and my colleague at Takeda mentioned, is something new, and a big force factor of that is regulations, particularly regulations like local or state-based regulations, as we see in Germany, France, et cetera. And it's only growing, but also regional regulations like CSRD and CSDDD in the EU. We've always taken the approach that addressing environmental and societal challenges requires really the same mindset. And because of that synergy of the two areas, both of our human rights work and our environmental work is housed under one team, which is the sustainability organization. And this has really set us up with a strong foundation as we're moving into this realm of combining our efforts and reporting on them to different countries who are requiring businesses to be more transparent in how they're addressing these issues.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for that. So we have to mention, we're here at the Center for International Development. The three of us have come from the NGO nonprofit world, right? Kyle and I were at Oxfam for some time. You did some time over at Environmental Defense Fund. Sneha, you were over at the ACLU, right? You were at Lawyering Project. So we come with that lens in terms of thinking about rights holders, a rights-based approach, and a lot of the work that we do entering this field. So I'm curious for the two of you, I guess we'll start with Sneha, kind of thinking about how is that core, if coming with that practitioner background, how does that play out for you in your day-to-day work? I mean, clearly, you bring that lens to everything that you're doing, but I was just curious, like, how do you see that play out, thinking about that international development, nonprofit NGO background?
Yeah, gosh, the grassroots perspective has really been invaluable in doing this work within the walls of a company as big as Amazon. I like understanding the lived experiences of vulnerable communities and what are effective ways to remediate the harms that they face every day has been indispensable for me to set up systems within a company this big that assess and address human rights at scale. I really believe that regardless of where you sit, whether it's the government and the private sector, a multi-stakeholder organization like the UN, it's critical to have been proximate to the harms people face in order to effectively solve for them. And, given the background of working at NGOs, I'm not alone in my team. My whole team also comes from the NGO international development and international human rights world. We have these tremendous relationships with stakeholders who provide really the best information we're going to get in understanding how we are impacting people. And really, without those relationships, it's really hard to have the trust for stakeholders to feel like they can come to us and we will listen and integrate what their experiences are and how we're addressing our impacts. So yeah, I think that it has been indispensable to doing this work.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, Kyle.
Yeah, another great question. So as Sarah mentioned, I spent a number of years at Environmental Defense Fund, a global environmental advocacy organization, and then Oxfam, where I had the pleasure to work with Sarah on something which I like to say at the time was probably the most controversial project at Oxfam, called a poverty footprint. That what was controversial at the time is we were collaborating with Coca-Cola, and that was, a lot of people were not happy about that. But nonetheless, it's been fundamental for me, because I don't want to say it forced. It actually wasn't a force. It gave me the opportunity to really learn about the issues from kind of the rights holder perspective, not from the corporate perspective. And I'm not saying that they're wildly divergent, but in some aspects for parts of companies, they are. And so it gave me the ability to, from an environmental perspective, to actually be expected to know the science pretty well and to know the issues and to learn from scientists on staff about the things that we were talking about to companies. And then certainly at Oxfam, one of the reasons I went there, which is that it was really focused on, and still is, kind of people at the center, livelihoods at the center, what is happening now to people's lives, particularly those that are in communities where they might not have kind of the agency that others do. And so one of the things I used to say when I used to have to wear a suit every day, when I sort of transitioned into the private sector, and I used to say, I'm an advocate in the CEO's clothing. And so I've tried to, now it's been probably, like Sarah said, 10 or 12 years since I've been in the private sector. But I think I'm still holding true to that sort of foundational intent of being at a company. And again, I'm not talking poorly about the private sector. Slower, there's a lot of bureaucracy, and people are in this role. They should be in this role because they have a passion for the issues that we're addressing. So that's easy for me, coming from where I came from at Oxfam in EDF. And so it's important to focus on, okay, not just the day-to-day, which is important, but like, why are we doing this? How can we have the most positive impact? Yeah, for the company. I mean, I'm sick of the term, thinking about like, how do we create business value through sustainability? Although it's important, like, let's not lose sight of the opportunity for a company like Takeda to try and do more good in the world. And it's, I mean, recent example, ongoing example, excuse me, we started talking about kind of regulation in CSRD. But any type of regulation. So on one hand, there traditionally is sort of, okay, from a climate perspective, from a human rights perspective, we need, ideally, there is some sort of regulatory framework that forces companies to change, to disclose, to report, to measure, and ultimately change. And I think that's fair. One of the fears I have, and some of the trepidation, is that regulatory requirements become the ceiling of what companies do. And so companies, instead of shifting from that mindset of impact and innovation and focusing on the issues, we start looking at regulation as, okay, everything we're going to do, everything we're going to disclose, we're only going to be as transparent as regulations require. Where something like CSRD, which, by the way, is a emerging sustainability related regulatory framework in Europe, are pretty robust across ESG in terms of what they will be asking companies to disclose. Into the effort, the programs, the focus, the ambition, the regulation should be the floor, right? Yeah, you need to adhere to regulation just like you do from a financial perspective, but your business strategy isn't based on what you need to disclose from financial regulations. So, long way of saying, I think, I'm continuing to remind the Takeda and people about that. And I'm not saying that I am, I have an outlier in terms of that perspective, but it's something we really need to keep in mind. So as we're embarking again as part of some of the regulatory requirements on something called a double materiality assessment. I don't know if any of you are familiar with materiality assessments. It's not too dissimilar from a human rights impact assessment. And so all of a sudden our CFO cares about it because we have to report to a regulatory framework. Great, got our foot in the door with the, you know, the CFO's office, and he's fantastic. But what I'm also trying to remind the business is that doing this assessment also is important to understand stakeholder needs and understand what matters to communities and what matters to people, which will inform our disclosure, but also should inform our strategy and what we do.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. And I was just thinking back to some conversations that we have with companies that the regulation is almost like an opportunity for them to include even more to get things through the legal department, right? Or the risk department. But it's also on the flip side, what you're talking about, Kyle, like let's make sure that that's not the ceiling. Let's make sure that's sort of the entry point, and then we can go even further. That's fantastic. Okay, we're going to some more real life examples of this work happening today. Like just thinking about human rights work that's happening related to your climate work, Kyle. We'll start with you. Just like in your operations, in supply chains, maybe even before the regulation conversation happened, kind of what are you seeing as kind of this practical example that you see taking place?
Yeah, a couple, and one was mentioned before in that there, rightly so, there are increasing stakeholder expectations that sure, companies focus on, you know, a people and planet perspective on their own operations, but increasingly the focus should be on their supply chain or their value chain. And so from a climate perspective for Takeda, in terms of our overall emissions, about 90% of our emissions come from our value chain. So quite substantial. We also have net zero emissions targets as well. But so that is requiring us to do a lot of work in terms of engaging our suppliers, trying to come up with accurate and comparable data and system, all in the context of, okay, we need to really be focused from a climate perspective on our supply chain and our value chain. But at the same time, a similar thing is happening from a human rights perspective, from a water access perspective. And so from a kind of a sustainable procurement perspective. So what it has allowed us to do is say, okay, we're prioritizing our supplier base by a few different ways. It could be spend, it could be activity, it could be, you know, sort of what type of product they are supplying to Takeda's business. We need to be thinking about that supplier engagement and the outcomes of those supplier interactions, not just from a climate perspective or an environmental perspective, but from a human rights perspective, from a labor perspective as well. And so it's allowed really close collaboration between parts of the organization that perhaps, again, wouldn't be working as closely together. Another opportunity is around clinical trials. And so clinical trials from an environmental perspective and a climate perspective are actually quite emissions intensive. And thinking going on about, okay, what do we do about that? One of the opportunities is decentralized clinical trials, which generally means not virtual, but you know, you're not necessarily bringing hundreds and hundreds of people on site to a location in order to conduct the trials. Is there a way to decentralize that a bit? So there's just less waste, there's less emissions. At the same time, it is well known that in the industry, clinical trials are not very diverse. It's just the nature of how they've sort of matured, and there's a real lack of representation, cross-cutting representation of communities when it comes to clinical trials. And so there's a lot of effort and thinking happening there. Is there an opportunity somehow through a more decentralized clinical trial model that could benefit the planet? It could benefit it from a climate perspective, but also provide an opportunity for an increased level of diversity and participation.
Great, thank you. Sneha, yeah, what do you see what is a practical example you're seeing in operations supply chains for you?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, fortunately for Amazon, we had started this work long before the regulations came about. So we have some pretty robust mechanisms in place to evaluate the human rights impacts as well as the environmental impacts of our business, and not only of our business, but also of our supply chain. So the values that we hold ourselves to on sustainability and human rights are also the values that we try to hold our supply chain to as well. And so that's given us some considerable runway in preparation for these regulations that are now requiring us to do this work. One challenge that we are facing at Amazon and within our team who's building out this global human rights and environmental due diligence program is we have the UNGPs that have set the normative framework for how companies should govern risks, how they should assess, mitigate, remediate these risks. And then you see this normative framework being codified in regional laws, like I mentioned earlier, in Germany, in France, and then CSRD and CSDDD at the EU level, which would ultimately be transposed in the States. And what we're finding is that while the UNGPs are the foundation for these laws, each of these laws have a slightly different approach to how businesses should actually evaluate their risks. And so as my colleague mentioned, like not wanting to take a compliance-driven approach, it makes it difficult when each of these laws is slightly different in what it requires us to do to evaluate our risks. And so we're trying to bring a harmonized approach across our regulatory compliance for all of these laws, so that we can, to the extent possible, fulfill the spirit of the UNGPs, which is really like evaluating what are the risks that you pose, prioritizing them, and meaningfully remediating them in a way that actually changes the way we are doing business and the way that we work with our supply chain and our entire value chain. And so that has definitely been a challenge for us. In terms of other opportunities that the regulations have brought about, we have already been doing this work. We've published some human rights impact assessments. Our Twitch business, which is a live streaming platform, our devices business, which produces like actual consumable products. Amazon obviously covers a huge breadth of types of services and products. But we are also finding that the regulations is a driving force for bringing human rights and environmental impact assessments to parts of the business that haven't yet engaged at this level. And so that's really an exciting opportunity in terms of expanding the scope of the work. And we're trying really hard to make sure that it's not a floor, it's not a ceiling, it's a floor, and that we, as my colleague mentioned, and that we really are trying to do right by the people that we're trying to impact.
Great, thanks so much. I think we're going to turn to the audience. So do you want one of these mics? Perfect.
Hi, my question is for Sneha specifically because Amazon it has its presence globally, and every country has different standards and different laws. So one, how is that reconciled? And also that has a major bearing on the cost, and usually higher standards in terms of environment and labor regulations, human rights, they would, we believe, increase costs. And so how is that reconciled with the business?
Yeah, so at a minimum, the business follows the local laws and regulations of wherever we are operating, but those local laws and regulations don't set our own business standards for what we expect in terms of sustainability and human rights for our own business, but also for our suppliers. So while local laws and regulations are something that we comply with, we set higher standards when it comes to what we expect from our supply chain, our value chain, as well as our own business. And so we really pride ourselves on creating goals for ourselves that are much broader than what some of the local regulations and laws require. And then in terms of increasing costs. I'm not sure if you're asking whether implementing these governance mechanisms and addressing these risks increase cost for the business. Is that the question?
I think the labor costs would increase, is what is generally believed, that labor costs will increase if there are higher standards. So in countries where labor is cheap, uh, regulations and standards are generally lower. That's what I mean.
Okay, yeah. So we strive to ensure that everyone is being paid a fair wage who works for our company, who is, works for our supply chain, and it is something that we evaluate, which is what are the labor rights of the people who are supporting our company, and also ensuring that they are paid a fair remuneration for the work that they're doing as well.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the talk. My question's for Kyle. You were talking, I really love the idea of the regulations not being the ceiling but the floor. But in the case of Takeda, what do you think was the driver for demand to think in a sustainable mindset? Was it the regulations? Was it the leadership? I would because this is the role of regulations, right? To start putting a nudge to the companies. What do you think was the driver?
Yeah, thanks. And like other industries, the pharma industry already is so highly regulated, right? I mean, I mentioned trying to integrate sustainability into the product life cycle, which is fine if it's a brand new product. But how about a product that's already to market, that's already been approved? If we started shifting how we manufacture something, then we would have to resubmit it for approval. How would that work? but it might have to. But I think. So Takeda is just over 240 years old, and literally started with a person and a medicine cart, and so that's the reason. No. But what I'm getting at, and so I have been at companies that have great values and ethos for sure behind them. But at Takeda, everything is focused on, see if I get this right, in this order: patient, trust, reputation, and then business. And I've honestly never worked somewhere that really, really feels that way. And that's not to say there is no focus on profit or growth or financial performance for sure. But I've seen decisions made multiple times. I'm not talking an acquisition or divestiture, but decisions made that were the right decision, but perhaps more costly to the business or more time consuming to the business, but were the right thing for the patient or the right thing for communities or society. So I think that generally that there's just the idea of really being a good corporate citizen, and that has been within the company for a long time. But at the same time, the CEO, Christoph, who's been at Takeda for, I don't know, a while, probably 7 or 8 years, who interestingly enough was the first non-Japanese CEO. And I'm not saying this is why, but he has a real just passion for, again, really focusing on the patient first. He's a real passion around climate change. And so I think it does help when there's a CEO that firmly believes doing the right thing, not to run the company to the ground, but doing the right thing when possible, and prioritizing it is smart and appropriate for companies. Now, the regulatory aspect, to your point, certainly, and I sort of referenced this before, certainly has elevated the number of eyeballs within the company on these issues. And like was alluded to, it is really hard and takes a lot of time to try to understand what is happening in what country and what regulation is covering what, how are we prepared for it. So I think, again, the balance is really trying to keep the ambition high and the ambition in the right spot, while at the same time being prepared for these regulations that are coming. Not sure I answered your question. But.
we'll take a couple all together and then you can answer them all together.
So hi, I'm Fatima. I'm the ED here at the Center for International Development. Thank you guys so much for coming for this conversation, which I think is really timely given a lot of conversations that are happening on ESG. So I have two different questions, and I'm going to be provocative because one of the best parts of leaving my other lives and my other jobs, especially in government, is that you don't have to use scripted talking points. So I'm going to be a little bit provocative, and I have two questions. So first, my first question is to Sneha and Kyle. You're talking, thanks for bringing Europe into the conversation. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the United States, because you're seeing actually at state level, you're not seeing in the US what's happening in Europe with common frameworks, either at a national or geopolitical level in the blocks. You're seeing this happening. Texas is going a different way than California is going, for instance. Florida's coming up with its own thing. New York is coming up with its own thing. You could think, we could foresee a place where like you have 50 states with 50 new sets of regulations in addition to national blocks. And the worry with that approach is they're pretty divergent in what the floor ceiling calculation becomes. I could see a whole lot of lawyers being employed here to then really take an overly risk compliance approach. And so even if that's not your intent from a company point of view, as your starting point, just to kind of deal with regulation, it ends up as your endpoint, which really takes us backwards instead of forwards around what ESG and the UN guiding principles we're supposed to do. So I'd like for you to reflect a little bit with us around not so much where you're at today, but what you see coming. And because you're kind of not really regulated or governed in a kind of an accountability way, right, beyond shareholders, it's like self-governance in many ways. And then we as citizens have to kind of react to that space. And Sarah, I wanted to ask you a question, putting your old hat on, actually, from Oxfam, which is, what is your analysis of how the private sector is actually doing around ESG? Does it matter having any kind of impact beyond these talking points around what we should care about in society? Is the ESG framework actually helping us? We are 15% at the UN SDG mark. So we are failing completely in our approach, and the private sector is part and parcel of that. So what is your analysis of where we are now in 2023, especially looking at your pretty remarkable journey pushing for a lot of these things over the past decade? So thanks. I'll take a few questions. Oh, sorry. Please do compost on your way out because everything is compostable. I just came from the Sustainability Leadership Committee meeting. There are signs. If you're confused, I will help you figure out how to do it. But I do want to make sure that we don't keep throwing everything in the garbage. Thank you very much.
I'll take another question from the room. Yes. We'll do both of you together. So you'll have a whole host of things you can choose to talk about.
So also from my side, thanks very much for being here. It was very interesting so far. I have a quick question to the both of you, Sneha and Kyle. So what would you say are the biggest headwinds that actually have the potential of slowing the entire process and progress down?
And then we'll take one more and then we can, Sarah, maybe you can moderate the question. Come back. Okay.
Thank you for sharing your experiences. My question is to the both of you around data collection and how it can sort of help gain more momentum in the movement. And with more data, do you see, tools like machine learning and AI being useful in the work that is being done, especially around sort of using standardization across different regulators?
Perfect. Okay, let's start with the US question. Really glad you asked that. Sneha, do you want to go first and kind of what's playing out? Are we going to have 50 states with a bunch of different regulation? Yeah, what do you see playing out in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, I certainly can't speak for US regulators specifically, and particularly state regulators on what they're thinking or where their head's at. But what I can say, and I think Fatima alluded to this, is that fragmentation is not going to be great in terms of moving our goals forward and doing more when it comes to ESG and meeting our sustainability development goals. And when I say fragmentation, I mean fragmentation in policy making. Whether it's 50 different states with 50 different regulations or different countries in the EU with different regulations and then an overarching EU regulation that requires something else. That really, when you fragment the process-based requirements of how companies evaluate and govern these risks, what it's going to probably lead to is a more compliance-driven approach of making sure that we are meeting the mark for every single detail of every single one of these laws. What I really appreciated about the regulatory movement and codifying the UNGPs is that it was really focused on the processes that companies have to address these risks and guided by this international standard that's been widely accepted over the past decade. And so I think that it's worrisome that different states are considering different requirements for companies. And I think that we should strive for just a lot more synergy. And that also speaks to this second question of a headwind. I think a headwind is fragmented regulation that's not harmonizing its standards of what it's requiring companies to do.
So I think, yeah, that's a great question. So I can only speak generally to the environmental aspects, in particular climate. I think there's two aspects to it. So one is the state level regulatory approach for companies operating in those states or to a certain revenue threshold, or if you have a company there, you have an LLC in Delaware, and Delaware decides to do something. And then the second aspect is from the investor perspective. And so Takeda is traded on the Tokyo Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange. So you could have a state like Texas that is basically saying, hey, we're not going to allow any of our state pension plans or our public university pension plans invest in any woke companies that talk too much about ESG or seem to be making decisions that are more focused on, say, the environment versus fiduciary responsibility. So as far as Takeda is concerned, from a climate perspective, California recently signed a rule into law that will come into effect prior to a climate-related law that the SEC supposedly is coming out of. Based on, we will be governed by that based on the revenue threshold. I think one of the things that in New York is one of the things that we've seen so far, again, from the disclosure, from the climate disclosure perspective at the state level, although some not finalized yet, is those that have come out or are emerging, all have stated that they will accept existing disclosures that meet the requirements of the state level disclosure. And so that gets to this idea of harmonization, at least within the states. And so if we are already disclosing our Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions to the liking of what California is requiring through our annual disclosure, that will meet that disclosure. From the investor perspective, there's a lot of conversation at Takeda within government affairs and being very kind of proud of the work that we're doing from a sustainability perspective, believing that it builds reputation and goodwill with key members of the legislature that are important. But there are also members of the legislature that are important from a pharma industry perspective that might have less favorable reactions to a company that is out there being very proactive around sustainability. So that in that area, I think there's some really interesting conversations happening about how we navigate that.
Fatima, your second question, which is a great one, thinking about kind of where do I find hope? What's helping? Is ESG helping? Is it harming? What's going on in the landscape? From what I've seen coming over from the private sector department at Oxfam, where we launched a scorecard targeting the top 10 food and beverage companies, those companies they were already like kind of progressive, enlightened. There was already a lot of good work happening. So you think about all those companies that maybe are even more laggards or really need to catch up. I guess So there's a kind of, how do you get the others to be inspired, and regulation could be part of that for sure. What I've seen on this side of advising companies on human rights, I am really hopeful seeing like Kyle and Sneha, folks that are coming from the NGO, human rights activists who are going into companies and really trying to solve these really complex, hard issues, and really having that network of stakeholders to call on. That's fantastic. And I see more and more of that happening. One thing that worries me, and maybe regulation will help, is around like further down the supply chain, really thinking about how do you really create those channels so companies have that access, are listening directly to rights holders, really incorporating worker voice, thinking about access to remedy. Those are some of the things that feel tricky when we are working with companies. Like, who do we call on? And grassroots organizations are stretched. They don't have the time to engage in a saliency assessment. Some of them might, but it's really tough. So how do you really authentically, meaningfully engage with stakeholders? And if you can't be there in person, how does that look? So that's a piece that I think we're really going to be creative, innovative to really make sure that that's happening. And I think with the CSDDD, that will be really interesting how that plays out, to really thinking about the whole supply chain and engaging with rights holders. So that's, I'm hopeful, but I also, there's still a lot of work to do. Let's see. For both of you, maybe Sneha, we can go first with you. Kind of, you talked about the headwinds. Any headwinds?
Yeah, so I think two quick. One is data, kind of combining that question in that the measurement of non-financial performance in data is like still in the womb compared to how much time and effort standardization has gone into financial measurement and financial data. And so it is absolutely critical and expected that companies aren't just take us at our word, that you have to show the same amount of rigor in terms of your protocols, your processes, your systems that are capturing data, all of that, your accuracy, which again, when it comes to something like data from suppliers, is brutally difficult to get and then to validate as accurate. Being able to have that data is critical from a disclosure perspective, but also from a performance. Like, how can you be ambitious around making change if you're not sure if you're actually making change? And so I think things like generative AI and machine learning can help with that once that data is sort of part of the equation. The second headwind, I think, which is quite a big one, not just necessarily for Takeda, is there has emerged this sort of conflation between ESG and sustainability. So, and they're almost used synonymously, which I think is quite detrimental to progress. So ESG, by the way, it's just an acronym. What does it exactly mean? But a company's approach to ESG is all about risk management. It's a risk framework. How does labor scarcity, how does climate change, how does corruption, how do those things impact the financial value of a company? So fair, important to the capital market. It's important to disclosure. Companies need to treat it that way. Sustainability, on the other hand, is really about how sustainable are the company's activities in terms of the livelihoods of people, in terms of not reaching 1.5 degrees, limiting to 1.5 degrees Celsius from a planetary perspective. And what has happened is that there's this, they are used interchangeably. And so I think it is a distraction. It's used by ratings agencies. It's used by disclosures. There's something called the ISSB, which is purely focused on that inward-facing risk around these issues on financial value. Important to understand, measure, communicate. But there is a more important side of that equation that, to me, is very, very worrisome, that there tends to be an interchangeable use of those terms.
Let's see, Sneha, do you want to tackle the data collection? How are you maybe gaining momentum as a result? Thinking about AI and other aspects. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of conversations around generative AI and utilizing AI to bring more scale and scope to our due diligence programs. But in terms of the data collection aspect, one great thing about Amazon, just across the company, not just in its human rights team or social responsibility team, is it's an extremely data-driven company. And so we already have an incredible amount of information and data on our supply chain, on our own business that we have been able to ingest in building out these human rights and environmental due diligence tools for not only compliance with the regulations, but also broader, UNGP build out. And so it's something we can always improve on, but we actually have a pretty tremendous amount of data to go off of, which is making this process better for us, because we can not only rely on our own expertise and qualitative analysis, but also validate what we're finding as our biggest and priority risks against the data that we've already been collecting over the past several years. In terms of opportunities to use AI and generative AI, your generative AI models for due diligence will only be as strong as the data that it's built off of. And so we definitely continuously want to think about how we're collecting data, how it's organized, and how we can improve our data collection practices in order to build out better technological systems to help us conduct due diligence and expand the way that we're doing due diligence.
That's great. We have 1 minute left. I'm mindful of the time. This is fantastic. An hour just flew by. One piece of advice, since we're talking to people in different aspects of their career, their professional journey, one piece of advice that you want to offer is if someone wanted to come and work in, thinking about environmental due diligence, human rights due diligence, any piece of advice to think about?
I don't know if it's advice per se, but sort of a kind of state of where we're at is that I think, there are many more opportunities to have an impact, even in the private sector or outside of the private sector, than there were 5 or 10 years ago. And there's a real interest in diverse perspectives, diverse backgrounds. And yeah, certain jobs obviously will be technical, and people would be limited, and there would be barriers to entry. But I wouldn't be shy about, I wouldn't be shy about pursuing an opportunity when you might feel, I'm looking at my resume or something and it doesn't quite match up. You would be surprised how companies that are working on social environmental issues are really have a wide lens in terms of the type of team that they want to build in order to achieve the goals.
Yeah. Great. Sneha, piece of advice?
Yeah, I'll answer this just from my own personal perspective, which is, I think that before going and trying to have an impact at scale, try to get as close to the suffering as possible. And that was the mindset I took when I was launching my career, which is I really want to be in the trenches to understand how people are being impacted by the different systems that we as society operate within. And I knew that without understanding that, I couldn't effectively advocate for change at higher levels. And so really get proximate to the suffering before trying to have overarching impact. I would also say that it's important to understand systems and how they work, whether you're going to go and be an advocate within the government or within a private company. Really understanding how decisions are made and who holds those levers is important in order to make change. And so those are the two pieces of advice. And also the last thing I'll say is your career is long, and I'm still pretty early on in mine, I think. But understand what are the actual hard, tangible skills you need to develop in order to really effectively advocate for change. I think on a normative level, in terms of your ethos, you can believe that things need to change, but it's a much harder question to ask in terms of what skills do I actually tangibly need to develop in order to go and make that happen.
I would agree with all of that. And I think I would also add, don't be afraid to move around to different sectors. I think that we're seeing that more and more. Maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we were over at Oxfam, you had a lot of people who weren't coming over from the private sector, maybe a couple of recovering lawyers. But it really was a lot of development practitioners, which is fantastic. But I think moving around to sectors, Fatima's, you're a perfect example of that. Moving around to different sectors, don't be afraid of that. That really brings kind of an expansive view of what's happening as well, and how to be an advocate as well, as Sneha was saying. All right,
I didn't
we're gonna
think in a
close.
million
We have
years
just-
that I would be at Amazon. I did not think that that is where my career trajectory would take me. So definitely be open to different sectors.
That's great. Yes, absolutely. Sneha, Kyle, thank you so much. And thank you to this audience for your wonderful questions. Fatima, Kim, and the team, thank you for hosting lunch. Which, oh my gosh, you all have enjoyed right there. Thanks again. And for all of you online, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And then anyone that's joining us for the career chat following this will be down in the CID Center in the Rubenstein conference room. If you didn't sign up, we still have some open spaces. Thank you. And compost everything over here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good weekend.